Her skull was displayed on a silver platter, severed clean at the neck, her jeweled crown still hanging from matted hair soaked in blood. Queen Razia of Delhi, forgotten, erased, and betrayed. She was the only female monarch ever to sit on the throne of the Delhi Sultanate. But her power terrified the men around her. They whispered that she dressed like a man, rode with soldiers, rejected the veil. They called her impure, unholy, unnatural. And for that, for refusing to be silent, she was hunted like an animal, dragged through the streets, and executed by those who once pledged loyalty. Yet just months before, crowds bowed to her, coins bore her image, and royal seals carried her decree. How can one fall from divinity to disgrace so quickly? The answer lies buried in a story few dare to tell. A story of invisible crowns, of power worn in silence, and of queens who ruled in the shadows. In the palaces of the Abbasid Caliphate, another queen reigned, not by title but by command. Her name was Shajar al-Dur. She began as a concubine, bought and sold like silk, her fate dangling by threads in the hands of men. Yet behind closed lattice windows and beneath the silk-clad hush of harem halls, she plotted. When her husband, the Sultan, was captured by crusaders in Egypt, it was she who negotiated, she who ruled in his absence. And when he died suddenly, she did the unthinkable. She hid his death, forged royal decrees in his name, and filled the throne room with shadows. For days, Egypt bowed to a ghost, unaware a woman pulled their strings. But when the truth surfaced, she crowned herself. Alone, a queen with no king, and the emirs howled in fury. A woman sitting on the throne? Impossible. Her sentence? Death by slipper, beaten until her bones cracked, her body broken in insult. But her rule had changed everything. In the volcanic courts of imperial China, Zetian was not supposed to exist. A concubine in the Tang dynasty, silent among silk, she watched, she waited. When the emperor died, tradition demanded her banishment to a Buddhist convent. But Wu returned, not as a widow, but as a force of history. One by one, she dismantled her rivals. Babies disappeared in cribs, empresses were exiled in disgrace. Her rise was paved with punctured reputations and the dead eyes of courtiers who crossed her. Soon, she declared herself emperor, not empress, breaking a 1,000-year ceiling of patriarchy. Statues were carved in her honor, books rewritten to etch her name into eternity. But whispers never stopped. They said she crushed rebellion with molten iron, that she strangled her own kin to protect her throne. Was she a tyrant, or a genius cloaked in terror? They say power corrupts, but what does it do to someone forbidden to hold it in the first place? In the shadowed corridors of the kingdom of Nongo in 17th century Angola, Nzinga stood barefoot before a Portuguese governor. There was no chair for her. He wanted her on her knees. Instead, she motioned to a servant who knelt like a stool, lifting her above the insult. From that day they feared her, a woman who would not bend. When her brother died, she seized his throne by stealth and steel. She baptized herself in blood and strategy, converting to Christianity, not out of faith, but to lull Europe's gaze. She wore men's armor, led troops into battle, and outwitted enemies with treaties laced in poison. Year after year, they tried to break her. They burned villages, enslaved her people, sent emissaries with honeyed lies. But still she ruled, not as queen alone, but as a ghost of vengeance in the hearts of her warriors. When she finally died at 80, invaders sighed relief, yet centuries later, her name still shakes empires. For 40 years, she defied Portuguese colonization, protecting her people from enslavement through brilliant diplomacy and fierce resistance, creating alliances with rival European powers when necessary. In an era when African kingdoms were falling to colonial powers, Nzinga's strategic genius preserved Ndongo's sovereignty against impossible odds. In the icy halls of medieval Russia, Sofia Alexeyevna waited, forbidden from speaking in public, exiled to a convent since childhood, never meant to rule. But when her brother died mysteriously, and her half-brother Peter was still a child, Sofia stepped into the void with calculated precision. She orchestrated one of the bloodiest uprisings in Russian history, unleashing the Streltsy Guard in a night of purging vengeance that left Moscow trembling. Bodies dangled from palace gates by dawn, a grotesque warning to those who might challenge her authority. As regent, she manipulated the court like a velvet noose, silencing dissent behind a porcelain smile while conducting ambitious diplomatic missions with Poland and China. She commissioned the first higher education institution in Russia and sponsored new translations of Greek and Latin texts, bringing Western intellectual traditions to Moscow. Yet the boy she ruled over grew into a storm. Peter the Great returned hardened and unsparing from his European travels. Fearing her influence and the loyalty she commanded, he crushed the Streltsy rebellion, arrested her supporters, and forced Sofia behind convent walls. She lived out her remaining days under constant surveillance, her windows nailed shut, her name forbidden in court circles. But for 7 years, the soul of Russia had belonged to a woman the world tried desperately to forget, a shadow regent whose political brilliance rivaled any male sovereign in Europe. Hidden beneath the jeweled grandeur of the Ottoman Empire stood Kösem Sultan, one of the most powerful women in Islamic history. Born a Greek slave, she was ripped from her homeland, renamed like a possession, and thrown into the gilded prison of the imperial harem. But Kösem did not wilt. She manipulated palace politics with chilling precision, rising from concubine to queen mother, ultimately ruling as regent for not one but 2 sultans. Her enemies whispered her name in terror, calling her the Wolf Mother. She arranged assassinations by candlelight, poisoned rivals during prayer, and orchestrated rebellions from velvet cushions. For nearly 30 years, she dominated the Ottoman court through a network of spies and loyal officials, controlling the imperial treasury and military appointments while carefully maintaining the illusion of male sovereignty. She established diplomatic relations with European powers and patronized massive architectural projects that transformed Istanbul's skyline. When her grandson finally rose to the throne, he conspired with his mother to strangle the woman who had protected him as a boy. She died at 62, her voice silenced by the very dynasty she had preserved. Yet her legacy echoes through Ottoman legend, a woman who ruled from behind a lattice, unseen but omnipotent, crowned by fear and cunning, her shadow stretching across centuries of history. Long before the sun rose over France's gilded salons, there was Brunhilde of Austrasia, a Visigothic princess transformed by ambition and necessity. In 6th century Merovingian Gaul, she arrived as a foreign bride but quickly mastered the lethal game of Frankish politics. Gifted in diplomacy and warcraft, she forged alliances with popes, raised armies from fractured kingdoms, and ruled for nearly 4 decades when women were expected only to bear heirs and die in childbirth. Her strategic brilliance allowed her to serve as regent for her son, grandson, and even great-grandson, creating unprecedented dynastic stability during an era of chaos. But her ambition painted a crimson target on her back. For decades, she outmaneuvered jealous nobles, married her daughters into strategic thrones, and extracted revenge with the precision of a blade slipped through velvet. She built churches, repaired Roman roads, reformed taxation, and established monasteries that preserved classical knowledge through Europe's darkest hours. Yet her enemies never ceased circling, spreading whispers that she practiced witchcraft and murdered family members. When at last they captured her at age 70, they did not simply kill her. No, they subjected her to 3 days of public torture and humiliation before tying her to a wild horse. Her limbs bound to different directions as the galloping beast tore her apart. Her demise was a spectacle of hatred made flesh, a warning to any woman who dared wear a crown without permission. But even in death, Brunhilde's legacy could not be erased, her administrative reforms and political institutions influencing European governance for centuries after her bones were scattered across the Frankish countryside. And deep in the heart of ancient Korea, amid the sacred rituals of the Silla kingdom, Queen Seondeok rose not through bloodshed but prophecy. Born under a blood moon, legends swirled that she could speak with stars and hear ancestral voices in the wind. When her father died without a male heir, she ascended, a queen in a land of warrior kings. The court mocked her, priests prophesied doom, and nobles plotted her fall. But Seondeok saw further. She built the Cheomseongdae Observatory, the oldest surviving astronomical observatory in East Asia, aligning science with divine right. She transformed Buddhist temples into centers of learning and political power, introducing Chinese texts that revolutionized Korean scholarship. When rebellions erupted along Scylla's borders, she crushed them not just with soldiers, but with strategic alliances, celestial predictions, and brilliant foreign diplomacy with Tang China. Her reign shimmered with uncanny moments, flowering trees that bloomed out of season, stars that appeared in unexpected patterns, enemies who retreated at rumors of her supernatural insight. She commissioned massive infrastructure projects, reformed taxation systems, and strengthened military defenses against rival kingdoms, Baekje and Goguryeo. Though she never married or produced an heir, she secured her succession through her niece, ensuring continued female leadership. To her enemies, she was a dangerous anomaly. To her people, she was more than queen. She was fate incarnate, a ruler whose vision stretched beyond the boundaries of her time, her legacy carved into stone and stars. In the ink-slick corridors of Ming China's Forbidden City, another woman wore the crown invisibly, Empress Dowager Shu, consort to Emperor Renzong. She entered the imperial court as a concubine, taught to whisper, not speak, to bow and vanish. But her silence was not compliance. When the emperor died childless, Shu stepped forward, adopting a distant relative as heir and assuming control as regent. Officially, she was merely the dowager. In truth, she controlled every edict, every appointment, every breath that filled the brittle lungs of the dynasty. Ministers trembled before her, for she cloaked tyranny in ritual and masked order as obedience. She ruled for 15 years, veiled behind silk and incense, manipulating court factions with the grace of a calligrapher's brush and the lethality of a blade. She purged opponents through fabricated charges of corruption, rewrote government policies to strengthen imperial authority, and commissioned massive infrastructure projects that drained the treasury, but cemented her legacy in stone and water. Shu maintained delicate diplomatic relations with neighboring states while ruthlessly suppressing internal dissent, executing rivals who challenged her authority with public displays of brutality that belied her refined appearance. Yet history labeled her merely a caretaker, forgetting that it was her mind that steered an empire. Behind each delicate fan she held was a steel will, a ghost sovereign, walking untouched through the storm of dynastic politics. But peel back the silk curtains of history, and one final figure demands our breathless attention: Empress Theodora of Byzantium, a woman born in squalor who would one day eclipse emperors. Before thrones and golden mosaics, she danced for coins in the shadows of Constantinople's taverns, sold her body to the crowd's hunger, spat on by the empire she would one day command. But she was not broken. She rose beside Emperor Justinian, not as decoration, but as his fiercest mind. During the Nika riots, when the city burned and senators urged retreat, it was Theodora who refused. She stood before her trembling husband and said, "Royalty is a fine burial shroud." And so, they stayed. She orchestrated the slaughter that ended the rebellion, silencing 30,000 with no more than a nod. She reformed women's rights, outlawed forced prostitution, and rewrote marriage laws. When plague ravaged Constantinople, killing nearly half its population, she maintained governance while instituting revolutionary quarantine measures and public relief programs. She commissioned architectural marvels like the Hagia Sophia that still stand as testaments to Byzantine glory. The chroniclers hated her, called her immoral, blasphemous, monstrous. Yet perhaps it was fear, not truth, that inked those words. For Theodora, a woman of the gutter crowned in crimson, dared to reshape an empire with nothing but intellect, venom, and stone-hard resolve. And so we are left with silence, the kind that follows thunder, deep and humming. These women, these forgotten sovereigns, bore empires on their shoulders while history chose to remember only their male counterparts. Their names were stripped from temples, their deeds buried beneath sandstone and soot, their blood sponged from palace floors as if they had never existed. But listen closely, and you'll still hear them in the creak of forgotten libraries, in the broken seal of ancient scripts, in the echoes of rebellions that bear a woman's fury. They lived as specters in velvet prisons, ruling through whispers and shadows, shattering the illusion that power was ever truly a man's domain. Their stories remind us that history has always been incomplete, half-blind, and perhaps the truth has never needed a throne, only the courage to be told. These queens did not vanish. They were deliberately erased. But erasure is not silence. It is an invitation to remember, to uncover the hidden crowns that shaped our world through centuries of denied existence. In their absence lies our responsibility to excavate what was buried, to amplify what was muted, to resurrect what patriarchy sought to destroy. For in understanding these women's reigns, we glimpse not just forgotten chapters of history, but the very foundations of power itself, revealing governance that survived not through brutality alone, but through brilliance, denied its rightful place in our collective memory. And still there are names that tremble on the edge of remembrance, like the fading scent of incense on imperial skin. They were queens without tombs, sovereigns without statues, rulers whose whispers shaped centuries. Some reigned through shadows cast by others, their fingerprints brushed silently upon law scrolls, war maps, treaties signed in secret. Their crowns were metaphysical, forged not in gold but in desperation, intellect, and courage. They held power in their eyes long before it touched their hands, and though time stripped their portraits from palace walls and replaced them with male visages, echoes of their brilliance remain for those willing to see. They haunt the margins of chronicles and live between mistranslated lines. These forgotten queens did not simply rule their empires, they outwitted them, redefined them, bled for them. They established unprecedented diplomatic alliances, commissioned revolutionary architectural projects, reformed legal systems, and preserved knowledge during humanity's darkest hours. Their strategies for maintaining power often involved complex networks of spies, careful manipulation of religious institutions, and mastery of political symbolism that communicated authority without relying on traditional male expressions of dominance. As the world builds new histories, we must ask what it truly means to rule. Is it domination by sword, or resilience in silence, intelligence in strategy, and vision that transcends the limitations of one's time? So let us not search for crowns in gilded vaults or archives inked by men, but in the whispers that have survived centuries of deliberate erasure. These women did not inherit their power, they invented it through necessity and brilliance. They ruled, not because they were allowed to, but because they refused to be silenced by systems designed to exclude them. Their governance often incorporated innovative approaches to diplomacy, military strategy, and cultural reform that male rulers could not or would not attempt. They cultivated networks of female advisors, created unprecedented educational opportunities for women, and established administrative systems that outlasted their reigns by generations. Their legacies are not mere historical footnotes. They are revolutionary templates that demonstrate how power can be wielded effectively from the margins. In every archaeological site where a queen's name has been chiseled away, in every chronicle where female rule was diminished as temporary or illegitimate, their influence persists. History, though manipulated by those who feared female authority, cannot fully erase their achievements. They survive in architectural wonders, in legal codes, in diplomatic treaties, and in the cultural memories of societies they transformed. As we continue to uncover their stories, these forgotten queens emerge not as anomalies but as testament to women's persistent capacity for leadership despite overwhelming opposition. They are not cautionary tales but inspirations, not exceptions but evidence of what has always been possible when women refuse to accept the limitations imposed upon them. And so, in the dim glow of what history has left behind, we stare not just into the past, but into the very soul of power itself, raw, interrogated, and reframed. Each of these women, systematically erased and deliberately undermined, proved that true sovereignty is not merely draped in opulence or ordained by lineage. It is earned through strategic brilliance, cultivated in silence, forged in sacrifice, tempered in the pain of rejection, and hardened in the fire of resistance. They created innovative governance systems that male historians later attributed to kings and emperors. They established diplomatic networks that transformed international relations, commissioned architectural wonders that outlasted their dynasties, and implemented legal reforms that shaped societies for centuries. Their legacies bring with them a profound challenge, whispered through time to all who dare to listen. What if history wasn't written simply in ink, but deliberately crafted through calculated omission? What if every shattered statue, every unmarked tomb, every defaced inscription hides not mere obscurity, but evidence of female leadership too threatening to acknowledge? Their achievements were not anomalies, but demonstrations of leadership that flourished, despite overwhelming opposition. To remember these forgotten queens is not just to honor them, it is to actively undo centuries of cultural amnesia and historical manipulation. It is to reclaim justice wrapped in silk and soaked in blood. Let this not be merely the conclusion of their stories, but the beginning of a more complete historical understanding, the moment we collectively choose to stare unflinchingly into history's deliberately overlooked corners and finally recognize the brilliant crowns that have always existed in the shadows. Let their names be carved into thought, not stone. Let their voices return, not as faint echoes, but as thunder reclaiming the sky. For each queen forced behind a lattice or sacrificed to power's cruel altar, there are generations of women who survived because she once ruled. The world did not forget them by accident, it buried them out of fear. But every unearthed text, every uncovered inscription, every rediscovered monument pulses with their resistance. These women established unprecedented diplomatic networks, commissioned revolutionary architectural projects, reformed taxation systems, and preserved classical knowledge during humanity's darkest hours. They ruled through intelligence rather than brutality, through strategic brilliance rather than birthright. They did not wait to be chosen, they chose themselves. Across continents and centuries, from palaces to prisons, their defiance wrote blueprints for modern leadership, gender equity, and justice itself. They often governed through complex networks of female advisors, creating unprecedented educational opportunities for women, while establishing administrative systems that outlasted their reigns by generations. Where male rulers relied on traditional expressions of dominance, these forgotten sovereigns mastered political symbolism that communicated authority through innovation and vision. To tell their stories now is not just remembrance, it is rebellion against centuries of calculated omission and historical manipulation. And as long as we speak their names, raised thrones rise again through memory. Empress, queen, regent, ruler, they were more than titles. They were proof that history does not belong to men alone. It never did, and every shattered statue, every unmarked tomb, every defaced inscription bears witness to female leadership, too threatening to acknowledge, but too powerful to truly erase. So let their ruins breathe once more. Let the cracked tiles of vanished palaces and the dust-laced silence of scrolls sing with unburied truth. For these queens were not shadows behind thrones, they were the architecture of rule itself. They forged empires with ink and iron, held peace together through winds of chaos, and made leadership a question of vision, not gender. They imposed justice where none dared, challenged gods and emperors alike, and redefined what rulership could mean in the hands of those forbidden from holding it. Their crowns were never ceremonial, they were war-born and wisdom forged. Through strategic brilliance and calculated diplomacy, they created governance systems later attributed to male successors, their innovations obscured by patriarchal historians who could not acknowledge female genius. They established unprecedented educational institutions, reformed broken legal codes, and constructed architectural wonders that still stand as testimony to their vision. In the darkness where their names were whispered and then silenced, still they ruled us. Through every girl told she could not lead, every law written to exclude her, their silent resistance endured. This is no longer merely history. It is reckoning, it is return, it is justice untombed. The forgotten queens no longer wait in silence. They are already here, their legacy flowing through every woman who dares to lead, despite the barriers constructed to prevent her rise to power. So let this be their coronation, not in ceremony but in remembrance. Crown them not with scepters but with the truth long withheld. In the silence of textbooks, in the blank spaces of timelines, in the margins where their legacies were footnoted or erased, carve their stories in full. These women established innovative governance systems, created diplomatic networks that transformed international relations, commissioned architectural marvels that outlasted their dynasties, and implemented legal reforms that shaped societies for centuries. Their reigns were not mistakes to be corrected, but masterpieces that threaten the narratives power prefers to tell. They ruled through strategic brilliance rather than birthright, through intelligence rather than brutality, often creating unprecedented educational opportunities for women, while cultivating networks of female advisors whose influence extended far beyond palace walls. Let their names ring louder than the myths that buried them. louder than the voices that claimed they did not belong. Across continents and centuries, from palaces to prisons, their defiance wrote blueprints for modern leadership, gender equity, and justice itself. Raise statues not just in marble but in awareness. Teach their legacies not as anomalies, but as evidence of human potential, unconstrained by gender. In every classroom, in every political hall, in every whispered story told from grandmother to granddaughter, let them rise again, not as ghosts or lost queens, but as the rightful architects of civilizations half remembered and only now being reclaimed. History is not finished until we finish telling it truthfully. These forgotten queens were not appendices to kings, nor accidents of ambition. They were sovereigns who navigated centuries of violence, suppression, and deliberate erasure with genius that rivals any name in history's canon. Their rise was not blessed by those in power. It was forged in the crucible of resistance, in moments of whispered dissent and dangerous defiance. They established unprecedented administrative systems, cultivated intricate diplomatic relations, and implemented legal reforms that shaped societies for generations. Each held the line for women yet unborn, creating pathways of possibility through seemingly impenetrable barriers. In a world that still questions female leadership, their stories burn as both warning and prophecy, reminding us that power has never belonged exclusively to men, only the telling of it. This is the testament the world tried to bury, now exhumed from forgotten archives and overlooked inscriptions. The shadows of their crowns still stretch across time, daring us to remember what was made to be forgotten. Do not look away from these women who ruled through strategic brilliance rather than birthright, through intelligence rather than brutality. Their reigns are not over. They continue in every woman who rises, every system challenged, every truth resurrected from the silence. Listen close, for the queens are speaking again, their voices rising not as ghosts, but as the architects of civilizations half remembered and only now being reclaimed. Let their resurgence not dwell only in stories but in action, for if history once erased them, the present must enshrine them. The forgotten queens did not rule by invitation, they ruled by necessity, brilliance, and force of will. Today, their legacies demand more than remembrance. They call for restoration. Let their policies re-enter political discourse, their strategies inspire modern governance, their courage embolden future generations of leaders, regardless of gender. Teach their names beside Caesar and Charlemagne, praise their intellect beside Aristotle and Machiavelli, frame their portraits beside every statesman remembered by history. These women established revolutionary governance systems, created unprecedented diplomatic networks, reformed broken legal codes, and protected knowledge when civilization itself hung in the balance. They ruled not through inherited privilege but through strategic genius that rivals any celebrated male sovereign. Build monuments not to their suffering, but to their sovereignty. Reclaim the narratives warped by patriarchal fear. Restore their rightful place in the evolution of human civilization. This is our historical responsibility, our cultural obligation, and ultimately, our collective redemption. Because to forget them again would not just be historical ignorance, it would be a betrayal of truth itself. The forgotten queens are no longer lost, they are immortal, their wisdom echoing through centuries, waiting for us to finally listen. Their stories are not relics, they are rallying cries. For every girl told to shrink herself, for every woman whose competence is questioned before it's proven, these queens stand as fierce reminders that power is not granted, it is taken, fought for, and carved with iron resolve. Their voices echo within modern movements for justice, equity, and truth, not as metaphors but as historical fact. Their leadership was not a romantic exception, but irrefutable evidence that women have always governed with brilliance the world dared not name. They established unprecedented administrative systems, cultivated intricate diplomatic networks, reformed legal codes, and preserved crucial knowledge during humanity's darkest hours. Let governments cite them, let institutions teach them, let culture elevate them beyond footnotes and into prominence. Because remembering is not enough, restoration demands visibility, vigilance, and vengeance through truth. As long as injustice is excused by distorted history, as long as leadership is filtered through gendered myths, the work remains unfinished. And so we enshrine them not with stone but with story, not with pity but with power. The forgotten queens rise once more through our collective memory, their governance systems finally acknowledged, their diplomatic innovations finally credited, their architectural legacies finally celebrated. This time, they do not rise alone. Let this be where remembering ends and reckoning begins. For their crowns were not ornamental, their influence not minor, their reigns not accidental. These women were not deviations from power's script, they were its hidden authors. Every law they wrote, every rebellion they quelled, every alliance they brokered, speaks across centuries a truth undeniable, that sovereignty has never worn just one face, nor spoken with one voice. They established unprecedented educational institutions, reformed broken taxation systems, and constructed architectural wonders that still stand as testimony to their vision. They were queens without permission, leaders without precedent, redrawing the blueprint of leadership not with conquest alone, but with wisdom, resilience, and visionary force. Today, their silence is shattered not by pity but by reverence, not by myth but by fact. The time for whispers is over. Their governance systems are finally acknowledged, their diplomatic innovations finally credited, their architectural legacies finally celebrated. Their names rise again in curricula, in monuments, in governance models reborn, and in every little girl looking toward a future once closed to her. They live, not as ghosts, but as architects of justice. The forgotten queens are no longer forgotten. They are the past reclaimed and the future declared. Their return is not a memory, it is a manifesto. It demands more than names resurrected. It demands the restructuring of how we understand power itself. These women ruled not to defy men, but to define sovereignty on their own terms. They proved that leadership is not born from gender, but from vision unyielding, from courage sharpened in silence, from an unbreakable will to endure even when erased. They were not anomalies, they were architects. They instituted reforms that stabilized entire regions, brokered peace in generations of war, and preserved legacies in scrolls, structures, and souls. They commissioned revolutionary architectural projects, reformed taxation systems, and established unprecedented diplomatic networks that transformed international relations across continents. Their administrative innovations created governance structures that outlasted their reigns by centuries, often attributed to male successors by historians who could not acknowledge female genius. In royal courts where their very existence was contested, they mastered political symbolism that communicated authority without relying on traditional male expressions of dominance. Their crowns were invisible only because history refused to see them. But now, the blindness lifts. In every nation re-evaluating its story, in every classroom daring to teach true history, in every breath of a girl rising beyond expectation, their spirit persists. This is not the end of their chronicle. This is their coronation anew. History, at last, bows. Let the final breath of this story not be silence, but a resounding declaration that history owes these women far more than apology or admiration. It owes them reintegration, relevance, and reverence. For centuries, their brilliance was quarantined behind veils of myth, or erased from scrolls entirely, their legacies fractured by generations afraid to acknowledge their dominion, but no longer. Their reigns now reassemble like shards of long-buried stained glass, unstoppable in their luminosity. These queens established unprecedented diplomatic networks, reformed taxation systems, constructed architectural wonders, and preserved classical knowledge when civilization itself hung in the balance. Through strategy, sacrifice, and astonishing foresight, they redefined what governance meant, anticipating models of leadership modern societies still struggle to embrace. They mastered political symbolism that communicated authority without relying on traditional expressions of dominance, created educational opportunities for women, and cultivated networks of female advisors whose influence extended beyond palace walls. They speak now through every battle for equality, every recalibration of cultural memory, every step toward justice unshackled from legacy distortion. Their invisible crowns shimmer once more, not as phantoms of forgotten glory, but as living symbols of what was, what could be, and what must finally be restored. The forgotten queens no longer wait in shadows. History, bowed at last, now kneels before them. This is not just the story of women who ruled in secret. It is the story of how power survives censorship, how truth persists beyond propaganda, how brilliance cuts through centuries like sunlight against stone. For every name that was erased, another dared to reappear in the margins. These queens, unthroned, unstoried, untaught, were not anomalies but evidence. Evidence that history, when truthful, is a staggering mosaic of voices, many of them female, many of them silenced, all of them vital. Their stories demand to be inscribed, not in forgotten footnotes, but in the hearts and minds of those who will build the next empires, not with conquest, but with justice. They established unprecedented educational institutions, reformed broken legal codes, and constructed architectural wonders that still stand as testimony to their vision. Through strategic brilliance rather than birthright, through intelligence rather than brutality, they governed when all systems were designed to exclude them. Let their lives warn us, guide us, challenge us. Let every classroom, every archive, every monument ask who else was buried by power's pen, and then let us dig. For every forgotten queen we reclaim, we recover not just a ruler, but a piece of our collective truth. And it is time, long past time, that history be whole. Because the truth is, the annals of history were never empty of women. They were filled with them, only scribbled over, overwritten by the hands of chroniclers too loyal to the illusions of masculine dominance. These forgotten queens were architects of civilization, generals of peace, visionaries who saw past their time and built futures no one thought they could own. They established revolutionary governance systems, reformed broken legal codes, created diplomatic networks that transformed international relations, and preserved crucial knowledge during humanity's darkest hours. Their leadership was not romantic exception, but irrefutable evidence that women have always governed with brilliance the world refused to name. To recover their stories is not to rewrite history, it is to finally write it fully. So let this be the final word, not of conclusion, but of invocation. Queens rise again, not from tombs or thrones, but from tired lies turned to ash. In every girl taught to lead, every woman remembered rightly, their lost chapters flicker into flame. We are not merely reading the last line of their story, we are writing their return, and in doing so we begin to see the full shape of history, at last. So let the ink dry this time, not in erasure, but in testament. Let no more names be lost to wind and silence. These forgotten queens were not side characters in a larger tale. They were the authors of dynasties, the architects of justice cloaked in veils, the sovereign hearts of empires. Though time sought to undo them, burying their truths beneath patriarchal rubble, they rise through truth reclaimed. Their legacy lives not only in what they built, but in who we now choose to remember. They established unprecedented diplomatic networks, reformed legal systems, and preserved crucial knowledge when civilization itself hung in the balance. Through strategic brilliance rather than birthright, through intelligence rather than force, they governed when all systems were designed to exclude them. Let their crowns gleam once more, not as relics, but as luminous symbols of resistance, intellect, and rule. For they were never truly forgotten, only waiting for us to see them, and now we do. In their names, history becomes whole. Let them stand eternal, not in myth, but in memory made fierce and unbreakable. The forgotten queens are forgotten no more.